John had always been a cruel man in business, in life. His words and actions were merciless. He was used to things being done his way. He didn't believe in weakness, emotions, or anything that could stop him. But one day, his heart gave out, and he ended up in the hospital. The paramedics, seeing his condition, made it clear if they didn't act fast, he wouldn't survive the night. Money saved him. Luxury treatment at a private clinic, the best doctors. His power made it all possible. But the chief physician gave him a strange piece of advice. To recover, you need solitude, nature, fresh air, silence. There was something symbolic about that, and he decided it was time to change something in his life. He figured a house by the lake would be the perfect solution. When he first moved into the new house, he was charmed. A spacious mansion, surrounded by greenery, a beautiful view of the lake. Everything was just as he had imagined. But right from the start, he noticed something odd. The silence was too thick, too dead. And something about the air felt off. The house seemed to hide an invisible threat. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but the feeling never left him. Despite his unease, life started to settle into a routine, but everything changed the moment he and his wife Sarah stood by the window and heard a song. This wasn't just singing, it was magic. The melody seemed otherworldly. It sank into their souls, sending shivers down their spines. Sarah couldn't understand what she was hearing, but he immediately knew it wasn't just music. The singing started suddenly, as if invisible waves were penetrating their home. The tune was thick, alluring, but there was an underlying, almost predatory undertone. It felt like it was calling someone, or warning them. He looked out the window and saw a woman standing on the porch of the neighboring house, her arms raised to the sky as she sang. Sarah asked who she was. He answered bitterly that the woman needed to be dealt with. She was a nuisance. But his words didn't sound like they normally did. They were filled with something dark, something that made his wife feel scared. She knew him, but this was different. That day, she ignored his words. But the next morning, the situation escalated. He went to the fence again and met the woman. She was strange. Her eyes glowed with wisdom, and her voice was so confident that it was impossible not to believe her. She said her house was ancestral land, and she would never sell it. The next morning, he felt a strange sense of foreboding. Everything started to feel unreal. His own determination, his certainty that the neighbor had to be dealt with, began to crumble under the weight of that feeling. He didn't know what was happening to him, but he decided to act as he always did. In his office, he sat with a worried look on his face. His hand trembled as he brought the phone to his ear. A familiar voice answered on the other end, deep and rumbling like the sound of an engine. "I have a problem," he started. "Is it solvable?" came the terse response. "Absolutely." He mockingly responded that they'd see about that, but there was something cold and determined in his eyes. At that moment, her dog, a massive, threatening creature, jumped up and growled at him. It was terrifying. He instinctively took a step back. They talked briefly, a price was agreed, an address given, and the job was promised to be taken care of in a couple of days. The voice reassured him, but it didn't bring him much comfort. His wife entered the room, her face reflecting the unease that had seemed to hang in the air since they moved in. "Are you still thinking about this?" she asked cautiously. "Don't get involved," he snapped. She knew better than to argue. He wasn't the type to let doubt sway him, but deep down, something told her this wouldn't end well. The next morning, he announced they were leaving. "Back to the city, a couple of days. Better to stay away until this is taken care of." She silently nodded. She didn't know the details, but she instinctively sensed it had to do with the neighbor woman and her strange dog. They left quickly, with little preparation. The car rolled out of the gates, leaving behind the quiet house, shrouded in mist and a suspicious stillness. When the car carrying the problem solvers stopped by the neighbor's fence, the evening sky was darkening. The air felt heavy, like before a storm, but the sky stayed clear. These men knew their job. Everything was supposed to go smoothly and quietly, but they didn't know what they were up against. 4 men, strong, armed, confident in their impunity, got out of the car. The leader, a short man with a sharp gaze, motioned for the others to move forward. They crossed the gate, and that's when it started. It came suddenly, as though it was rising up from the earth itself. The melody was strange, beautiful and eerie at the same time. It didn't sound like any song they knew, as though it existed outside of time. The notes pierced their minds, making their skin crawl. The leader gestured for them to ignore it, but his men slowed their pace. One of them, a large man, suddenly clutched his head. "What the hell is this?" he gasped, his eyes squinting in pain. The sound grew louder, as though it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The man who had been holding his head collapsed to his knees, convulsing. His scream was swallowed by the melody, becoming part of it. The others gritted their teeth and pushed on, and that's when they saw him. The dog stood on the neighbor's porch, motionless, like a statue. Its eyes glowed in the dim light, 2 yellow dots. The men stopped, exchanging glances. One of them raised his weapon. "It's just a dog," the leader rasped, though its voice trembled. But it wasn't just a dog. The dog raised its head, and the air seemed to thicken around it. Its body began to change. The fur, black as night, rippled, as if alive, stretching into long shadows. Its spine arched, forming a massive ridge from which bone spurs protruded. Its legs lengthened, claws growing like daggers. Every crack of bones, every screech of transformation was so loud, it felt as though the world itself were screaming. Its mouth opened, widening to twice its size, revealing sharp, gleaming teeth. Its eyes burned with pure golden fire. A low growl rumbled from its throat, and the ground seemed to tremble. "Holy shit, what is that?" one of the men screamed, backing away, but it was too late. With a wild snarl, the creature leapt. In an instant, it was on the first man, knocking him to the ground. The jaws snapped shut on his neck, tearing it apart in one swift motion. Blood poured in a fountain, staining the grass. The singing grew louder, filling the air around them. It seemed to guide the events, giving them a hypnotic rhythm. The second man opened fire, but the bullets only seemed to enrage the creature. It turned toward the shooter, and for a moment, their eyes locked. In that gaze was an ancient, inhuman fury. Another leap, and the shooter's body fell to the ground, his chest torn open. His scream was cut short so abruptly that the sound lingered in the air. The creature stood on its hind legs, its silhouette towering like a nightmare. The remaining 2 scattered, but the singing held them in its grip. It played directly in their heads, disorienting them, draining their strength. One of them slipped, and the shadow seemed to stretch out to hold him. The creature moved slowly toward him, relishing the moment, as if it knew there was nowhere left to run. Its claws ripped through his flesh with ease, and he never had the chance to scream before his face disappeared into the shadow of its torn hood. The last man, the leader, tried to run, but his legs seemed to betray him. He turned, seeing the figure of the woman standing before him, surrounded by a shower of fog and music. Her eyes glowed just like the dog's. "You came here with dirty intentions," she said softly, her voice a mix of a whisper and a thunderclap. "Now the earth claims you." The dog werewolf lunged one final time. With a scream that no one would ever hear, the leader disappeared into the shadows. John and his wife Sarah returned to the house after a few days. It was just as quiet and serene as they had left it. Tall pines whispered in the wind, and the lake mirrored the overcast sky. The neighbor's house stood motionless, like a monument to silence. John scanned the property. No signs of life, no strange woman, no creepy dog. Finally, he thought with relief, the plan had worked. The neighbor and her beast had disappeared from their lives forever. "It's all over," he told Sarah as he opened the door to their home. She didn't answer, only casting a quick glance his way. Her silence felt odd, but he attributed it to fatigue. The first 2 days passed quietly. John, finally able to relax, slowly slipped back into his normal routine. He even felt certain that everything was over. The woman, her dog, the singing. It was all just an unpleasant memory now. But by the third day, unease began to grow. The neighbor's house remained lifeless, the windows dark. John caught himself staring at it more often, standing by the window for long stretches. At first, he tried to tell himself that he was just checking the area, but deep down, he knew. He was waiting for something. That evening, he noticed Sarah starting to act strangely too. She was distant, as if constantly lost in her thoughts. "Are you okay?" he asked her at dinner. She nodded, but her eyes seemed to look through him. Later that night, John heard someone softly humming. The sound came from the kitchen, faint but unmistakable. He knew that melody. It was the same song. His heart thudded in his chest like a hammer. Slowly, he made his way downstairs. Sarah stood at the sink, her back to him. Her voice was soft but clear, each note echoing in his mind. Sarah jumped and turned around. "What? Don't sing!" He grabbed his head, feeling panic wash over him. She frowned, confusion in her eyes. "What are you talking about? I wasn't singing." John froze, staring at her. "You were singing," he whispered, almost to himself. "No," she answered firmly. "I was just doing the dishes." He turned away, sitting on a chair, trying to calm down. But her words wouldn't let him go. She had been singing, he had heard it. Her voice had sounded like she wasn't herself. That night, he couldn't sleep. Lying in bed, he replayed the events over and over in his mind. Why had she done it? Where had that melody come from? The next days were a torment for him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house. The silence no longer comforted him. It pressed in on him. Every night he would get up and go to the window. The neighbor's house stayed dark, but it felt like someone was watching him from those windows. At some point, he began noticing small, odd things. He thought he saw shadows moving across his property, though the trees couldn't have cast them. There were light, almost imperceptible footsteps behind him. But when he turned around, no one was there. His paranoia grew. On the 5th day after their return, he heard the singing again, this time from the bedroom. Sarah was lying next to him, her eyes closed. She hummed the same melody, her lips barely moving. "Enough," he shouted, tearing himself out of bed. Sarah bolted upright, fear on her face. "Why are you shouting?" she asked. "You were singing again." His voice broke as fear overwhelmed him. "I was asleep." Her voice was filled with anger and hurt. Breathing heavily, John stood in the middle of the room. She was right. Her eyes looked sincere. But then why had he heard that melody again? He went downstairs, leaving Sarah in the bedroom. Sitting on the couch, he tried to sort out his thoughts. But one thing was clear. The neighbor and her dog hadn't disappeared. They were just waiting. And that melody, it hadn't gone away. Now it played inside his head. Days passed. He started hearing strange noises at night, footsteps around the house, rustling sounds. And then, one day, he woke up, suddenly feeling her presence. The woman was standing in his bedroom. She was right there, her eyes glowing. He jumped up, shouting that he couldn't allow her to be there, but she just stared at him, her gaze strangely calming. Then she disappeared. He was terrified, but tried to calm himself. It's just a nightmare, just nerves from being sick. But with each passing day, the hallucinations grew sharper. He began seeing her in all sorts of places, in the hallway, in the mirror, through the window. She appeared unexpectedly and vanished just as quickly, and her eyes, always filled with something frightening, something that made him doubt his perception. The strange dog was always there, watching him. John was sure the dog was stalking him. Sarah began noticing his strange behavior. She started hearing the singing too, but couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. Sometimes it seemed like the woman was standing behind them, but when she turned around, no one was there. These strange appearances started making her nervous. But John, unable to fight it, was losing control. He was certain now that the woman needed to be gotten rid of. He decided that if he didn't rid himself of her, his life would turn into a nightmare. One day, while he and Sarah were sitting in the house, the singing filled the air again. That eerie, mystical melody rang in their ears like an omen. John went outside, and at that moment the woman appeared before him. She was standing by the fence, and her dog, staring at him with its yellow eyes, stood beside her. "You can't get rid of me," she said quietly, but her words seemed to penetrate his soul. A terrifying voice echoed in his head. "You can't." And then he saw her eyes flare up, glowing yellow, just like the dog's. He felt his mind begin to slip away as the world around him began to blur. At that moment, his wife saw her again. She was standing in their house, right in the hallway. But how was that possible? She had just been outside. And then, true panic set in. He saw the woman in the mirror, saw her in the window, and then heard her voice whispering in his ear. He screamed, throwing something to the floor, but he was utterly helpless. His mind was shattering, and fear filled every part of him. Sarah, too, began seeing her. The woman appeared in different places, by the table, in the shadows. She could feel her mind unraveling, losing touch with reality. John stood by the window, his gaze empty, as if his mind no longer belonged to him. He saw the woman's figure appear on the horizon. In her eyes was coldness and power, like some being that was not bound by time or human effort. He couldn't understand what was happening, but in his head one thought rang louder than all the others. "You can't get rid of me." Those words became his curse. They were no longer just echoes of his fears. They became part of his reality. And she, this woman, became his dark shadow. He turned, and his eyes met Sarah's. In her eyes was a canvas of fear, a mix of pain and worry. She approached him slowly, carefully, as though afraid any move she made would be wrong. "You don't believe in this, do you?" Her voice was quiet, trembling, as if she already knew the answer. He didn't answer. His gaze was empty, without feeling. Everything in his mind was a blur, and reality and fantasy merged into one unbearable pain. You don't understand," he whispered, but Sarah couldn't understand. Her world was built on feelings and relationships, while his world, the world of harsh decisions and calculations, had suddenly been shattered. John didn't know what this was, punishment or vengeance, but the feeling was like a blow to the chest, like an invisible force that wouldn't let him go. The problem wasn't just with the woman. The problem was that everything he had thought, everything he had done, every action, every step had led to this moment. He hadn't just disturbed someone's peace. He had disturbed something bigger. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was a keeper of order, a judge who punished evil. And he, with his dark intentions, had become part of her game, her laws. Now he was nothing more than a victim. Dark intentions had led him here, to this house, where there was no simple distinction between good and evil. There were no conditions for redemption. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking restoration. The woman was not just a being, she was a force, carrying out balance, guarding order, punishing those who broke her laws. And the dog, her faithful companion, was not just an animal, but part of her essence. John felt this when he looked in the mirror. It wasn't his image, his reflection. In the mirror stood her, the woman. Her face was smiling, cold, and filled with something inexplicable, something beyond human understanding. She had taken him, erased his mind, and now all that remained was a frightened man trapped between two worlds. Suddenly, the world grew even darker. The shadows seemed to grow longer, the night more silent. The woman's voice filled the air again, and Sarah too felt the chill. Both of them knew that nothing would be the same again. And now they were both caught between the woman and the shadows.